Well, I've seen you everywhere lately, and your work is really prolific. You recently published an article in Liberation News about the history of the far right movement in Ukraine, and I've seen you on Breakthrough News. More recently, I've seen you on Justin's podcast and Sina's podcast, Issa's podcast, talking about the history of Western Marxism, or what you call cultural Marxism, in the States in academia, and how that's part of what you call a compatible left or a non-communist left. But you also do a lot of research on fascism as well. And I wanted to get you on today to talk about fascism and, the political economy of fascism, because I think it's really important to understand, especially since our definition of fascism is really limited by our bourgeois understanding of it. So maybe to get started, I think one of the more frustrating things when we talk about fascism is that in the absence of any kind of materialist analysis, I see the term really loosely applied. Like, often people use it to describe any and everything, like any kind of repression by a state entity. Any country I don't like is fascist. Individual actions are fascist. Things individuals say are fascist. So as historical materialists, how should we understand and approach fascism?
It's a great place to start because I couldn't agree more that so much of the bourgeois discussion of fascism really focuses on what I would call epiphenomenal traits or superficial elements, and it doesn't go to the root causes of fascism and the kind of matrix of economic and political relations that produce fascism in the first place. And so maybe I could start by just kind of outlining what I see to be some of the fundamental features of the bourgeois concept of fascism, so that then we can mine down more deeply than that. One thing that the bourgeois approach to fascism does is that it assumes that it's primarily ideological, right? It's a set of bad ideas, poor dispositions, ways of feeling about the world, right? I saw recently people talking about the micro-fascist aggressions within ourselves and other such things. And so fascism is ideological, right? It's somehow not linked to the capitalist forces that drive ideologies. And the other thing that is very widespread is what I refer to as a kind of ideology of fascist exceptionalism. Fascism isn't structural, it's not systemic. It is instead something that is intermittent, that is a threat, and that has come about and been instantiated in very specific cases. Hitler, Mussolini, in the current moment, Trump as a threat. And so then it becomes singularized. And the reaction then on the part of those who want to struggle against fascism is we're trained that, well, it has to be ideological, right? We have to reject the politics of hate, join the so-called resistance by buying the New York Times or other consumer products for the professional managerial class. And we have no way of combating the more systemic elements because it's all individualized. And we can only then confront it as an enemy that has kind of intermittent faces as opposed to a systemic problem. The advantages of a historical materialist approach are many, but some of them consist in the fact that historical materialists will always identify the ways in which ideologies, such as the ideology of fascism, are rooted in a socioeconomic system. So one of the very first things that's extremely important about fascism is it is a product of the capitalist system. It did not exist, at least in its, in the forms that it takes today, prior to capitalism. It also is a force that is operative in every capitalist country. And this is immediately visible in what some people refer to as European fascism, or the classical fascist model that emerged in the interwar period, because you had capitalist movements in every single, you had fascist movements in every single capitalist country in the wake of the Great Depression, right? So there's a direct and structural link between capitalism and fascism. That's important as well because, of course, fascism is in part an ideology, it's in part a worldview, but it's a worldview that is anchored in a system, the capitalist system, that has different ways of managing the population to which it wants to subject capitalist social relations. One way of doing that is through liberal ideology and cultivating a politics of acquiescence, a politics of consent, right? You give the uh, particularly within the capitalist core, members of the professional managerial class or of the middle and upper classes certain rights and representation in government. And what you get back in return for that is rule by consent. But the more insurgent forms, the more insurgent elements within the working class, particularly within the international working class, if they can't be governed by consent, well, how do you get the job done, so to speak? And fascism is one of the key elements in the arsenal of the capitalist ruling class. If it can't rule through liberal ideology, then it uses fascist ideology and fascist practices in order to use, to speak simplistically, to use the stick instead of the carrot. This also means then that the response to fascism is very different. It's not about hating particular politicians for the gross things that they say or comparing, particular politicians to Hitler or other such things. We need a systemic response to a systemic problem. And that systemic response is going to the roots of fascism. And given that the roots of fascism are the capitalist system, the only way of really dealing with and getting rid of fascism is to abolish capitalism. And that's one of the reasons you alluded to this a moment ago, but the writings that I've done on contemporary fascism, such as the situation in Ukraine, are so important because the era that we're living in spite of the fact people will sometimes use this vocabulary, it's not an era of neo-fascism or neo-Nazism. These things never went away. These are structural elements within the capitalist system that go through ebbs and flows. And I think it is true that in the current moment, there is an intensification of fascism and authoritarian modes of government globally. And so a final thing that I'd say is that historical materials can also begin to explain why that is the case, right? It's not just that people want to hate more, or they're more racist or xenophobic or other such things. No, it's the crisis of the capitalist system that through its neoliberal phase of accumulation beginning in the 1970s has not been able to resolve its internal conflicts. And so summing all of this up, I'll reference the great Michael Parenti, who gave perhaps the most succinct definition of fascism that I've come across, and that is that fascism is the final solution to class struggle. When the capitalists have their system that's crumbling, their political legitimacy that's withering away, and the threat of socialism, what do they resort to? They resort to mobilizing armies of petty bourgeois, unemployed, and lumpen proletariat in a war against the socialist movement globally, and with the goal of ultimately, and we saw this clearly in the case of Nazis, the Nazis genocidally eliminating those threats to the capitalist system.